First contact. Xylot's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the files again. The blue-skinned Zorkax diplomat had studied the reports on humanity 100 times, but they never failed to unsettle her. Compared to the orderly, rational Zorkax civilization, humans seemed chaotic, impulsive, even savage. The casualty figures from their wars boggled Xyloth's mind. The damage they could inflict on each other with their weapons sent shivers down her spine. Even their history of exploration, a supposed strength, read like a chronicle of recklessness to her. They charged out into the unknown, discarding caution, and frequently perished because of it. And now the duty fell to Xyloth to make first contact with this volatile species. The Zorkax Empire had detected their radio signals and monitored them from afar for decades. But with human technology advancing at an alarming rate, the Zorkax leadership decided they could no longer stay in the shadows. Contact had to be made, for better or worse. As one of the Empire's most respected diplomats, Xyloth was the natural choice for this pivotal mission. However, natural aptitude didn't make the assignment any less daunting. She paused a video of humans engaged in some brutal physical competition, wincing as they crashed into each other with devastating force. "They're so fragile compared to us," she murmured to herself. "How can they subject their bodies to such trauma? And for what purpose?" It made no sense. Then again, very little about humanity made sense to Xyloth. Their art, filled with clashing colors and dissonant sounds. Their literature, obsessed with conflict and drama. Even their science, as brilliant as it could be, often seemed to lack the elegance and efficiency prized by Zorkax researchers. Despite all her reservations, some part of Xyloth remained deeply curious about humans. There were flashes in the data, acts of self-sacrifice, transcendent works of creativity, breakthroughs that upended paradigms, that hinted at hidden depths. Something in their chaotic nature called to her, even as it repelled her. A chime from her communication console roused her from contemplation. She tapped the glowing panel, and an image of Kethzar, her aide and closest confidant, appeared. Diplomat Xyloth. Kethzar greeted her with a formal head bow. "We've entered the Sol system and achieved orbit around the human homeworld. The local species refers to it as Earth." He pronounced the alien word carefully. Xyloth took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. "Thank you, Kethzar. Has there been any response to our hails?" "Yes, diplomat. We received a reply from the human global governance body, the United Nations. They've designated an ambassador to meet with you on the planet's surface." "Very well." Xyloth stood, smoothing out her shimmering robes. "Prepare a shuttle and an escort team. It's time I met these humans face to face." The console dimmed, and she was alone again with her thoughts. She knew the prudent approach was to arrange the meeting in space, on neutral ground. But she needed to see the humans' world in person, to experience the environment that had shaped such a confounding species. It meant more risk for her, but Xyloth had never shied away from the demands of diplomacy. As she made her way to the shuttle bay, she squared her shoulders and raised her chin. She was a representative of the mighty Zorkax Empire. She would face humanity with courage and poise, no matter how her nerves rattled inside. The shuttle slipped smoothly out of the ship and descended toward the blue-green marble that was Earth. Xyloth watched the planet's features resolve as they drew closer. Vast oceans, swirling white clouds, sprawling webs of light that marked the human cities. It was a view that inspired both awe and foreboding. She could sense the vibrancy and energy of this world even from afar. But would that energy greet her with open arms or bared teeth? There was only one way to find out. Xyloth braced herself as the shuttle dropped towards the meeting coordinates, into the cradle of humanity, into the unknown. A rough landing, the shuttle shuddered as it hit Earth's atmosphere, jostling Xyloth in her seat. She gripped the armrests tightly, her stomach lurching with each bump and rattle. Flying through a foreign atmosphere in an unfamiliar vessel was always nerve-wracking, but the turbulence seemed especially severe this time. "Is everything all right?" She called out to the pilot, trying to keep the concern out of her voice. "Just some unexpected weather patterns, diplomat," the pilot replied, his tone calm and professional. "Nothing to worry about. I'll have us on the ground shortly." Xyloth nodded, not entirely convinced, but placing her trust in the pilot's skills. She turned her gaze back to the viewport, watching as the blues and greens of Earth grew closer and closer. A rough landing. The shuttle shuddered as it hit Earth's atmosphere, jostling Xyloth in her seat. She gripped the armrests tightly, her stomach lurching with each bump and rattle. Flying through a foreign atmosphere in an unfamiliar vessel was always nerve-wracking, but the turbulence seemed especially severe this time. "Is everything all right?" she called out to the pilot, trying to keep the concern out of her voice. "Just some unexpected weather patterns, diplomat," the pilot replied, his tone calm and professional. "Nothing to worry about. I'll have us on the ground shortly." Xyloth nodded, not entirely convinced, but placing her trust in the pilot's skills. She turned her gaze back to the viewport, watching as the blues and greens of Earth grew closer and closer. As they descended through the cloud layer, a vast expanse of green came into view, a dense forest stretching out to the horizon. Xyloth marveled at the abundance of plant life. It was so different from the carefully manicured gardens and parks of Zorkax cities. The shuttle angled toward a clearing in the forest, presumably the designated landing site. Xyloth could see a small group of figures waiting at the edge of the open space. Even from a distance, she could tell they were different from her kind. Taller, broader. Their stances exuded a kind of coiled energy that set her on edge. As they made their final approach, a sudden gust of wind rocked the shuttle. The pilot cursed under his breath, fighting with the controls. Xyloth's heartbeat quickened as the ship listed to the side, the ground coming up fast. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted, a note of real fear in his voice now. Xyloth barely had time to process the words before the shuttle slammed into the earth with a teeth-rattling jolt. She was thrown forward, her restraints digging painfully into her chest as the ship skidded across the ground. The shriek of tearing metal filled her ears, drowning out her own involuntary cry of terror. And then, as abruptly as it began, it was over. The shuttle lay still, half buried in churned-up soil and shattered trees. Smoke filled the cabin, acrid and thick. For a moment, Xyloth couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Pain lanced through her body from a dozen contusions and lacerations. Blood trickled into her eyes from a cut on her forehead. But she was alive, miraculously alive. A groan from the direction of the cockpit roused her from her shock. The pilot. She had to check on him, see if he had survived. She fumbled with her restraints, her fingers slick with blood, finally managing to release herself. She half crawled, half stumbled to the front of the shuttle, her injured leg dragging behind her. She found the pilot slumped over the controls, a jagged piece of metal protruding from his chest. Dark blood pooled beneath him, and his eyes stared sightlessly forward. Xyloth choked back a sob, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She was injured, alone, stranded on an alien world. Her escort team, her only lifeline, had been taken from her in a blink, and she knew with grim certainty that the humans waiting outside had witnessed the crash. What would they do? They were an unpredictable species at the best of times. And now, confronted with an alien ship smashing into their planet, she couldn't imagine they would respond kindly. Fear flooded her veins with icy dread. She thought of those human videos, the casual brutality they had displayed. Would they finish what the crash had started? Would she die light years from home, torn apart by these strange, violent creatures? There was a pounding at the shuttle door, the sound of muffled voices. Xyloth's heart raced painfully fast. She looked around desperately for a weapon, a hiding place, anything. But there was nothing. She was utterly defenseless. The pounding grew louder, more insistent. And then, with a screech of tortured metal, the door was wrenched open. Light spilled into the cabin, silhouetting a massive human figure. Xyloth cowered back, raising a hand as if to ward off a blow. She knew it was futile. She was at their mercy. All she could do was wait for the end and pray it would be quick. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard a voice, deep and resonant, tinged with what sounded like concern. "My God, are you all right?" Xyloth blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Slowly, she lowered her hand, her eyes adjusting to the light. She found herself looking up into a pair of striking green eyes, set in a chiseled, unmistakably human face. The man was crouching just inside the shuttle, his muscular frame filling the doorway. But there was no anger or aggression in his expression, only a kind of earnest worry that seemed utterly at odds with everything Xyloth thought she knew about humanity. "You're hurt," he said, his gaze sweeping over her battered form. "Don't try to move. We'll get you out of here." He reached out a hand, palm up, the universal gesture of aid. Xyloth stared at it, her mind reeling. This was not the reception she had expected, not by a long shot. The human was offering to help her. But could she trust him? Could she afford not to? Hesitantly, her hand shaking, Xyloth reached out and placed her blue fingers in the human's warm, calloused palm. She had crossed the vast gulf between stars to reach this moment. Now, she would discover if it was a bridge or a chasm, an unexpected alliance. Xyloth winced as the human carefully helped her out of the wrecked shuttle, his strong arms supporting her weight. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her battered body, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. As they emerged into the sunlight, Xyloth got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was tall, even by human standards, with broad shoulders and a muscular build that spoke of a life of physical exertion. His dark hair was cropped short, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, giving him a rugged, dangerous air. But it was his eyes that held Xyloth's attention, those vivid green eyes that had first met hers in the shuttle. They were filled with a depth of emotion she had never expected to see in a human: concern, curiosity, and a glimmer of something that might have been compassion. "I'm Ethan," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ethan Stark. I'm the ambassador the United Nations sent to meet you." Xyloth nodded, trying to gather her composure. "I am Diplomat Xyloth of the Zorkax Empire. I apologize for my unorthodox arrival." Ethan's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "No need to apologize. I'm just glad you're in one piece. That was quite the crash." He helped her over to a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, easing her down to sit. Xyloth couldn't help but marvel at the gentleness of his touch. It was at such odds with the brutality she'd seen in the human records. Ethan knelt beside her, producing a small med-kit from a pocket on his uniform. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her injuries. Xyloth hesitated. Allowing this human to treat her wounds felt like an immense risk. But what choice did she have? She was in no condition to fend for herself. Slowly, she nodded. Ethan set to work with a surprising delicacy, cleaning and dressing her cuts and scrapes with a sure, practiced hand. Xyloth watched him warily, half expecting his demeanor to change at any moment. But he remained focused on his task, his touch never straying from professional. As he worked, Ethan spoke quietly, as if sensing her unease. "I know this must be strange for you. Crash landing on an unfamiliar planet, being thrown into the company of a species you've never met. I can't imagine what must be going through your head right now." Xyloth swallowed hard. I confess I am unsure what to expect. My people have observed humanity from afar, but we have never interacted directly. And what we have seen has been concerning." Ethan paused, meeting her gaze. "I can understand that. We humans have a checkered past, to put it mildly. We've been violent, destructive, short-sighted, but we've also been brave, innovative, and resilient. There's more to us than our worst moments." Xyloth held his gaze, searching for any hint of deception. But all she saw was sincerity. It was unsettling. Everything she thought she knew about humans was being challenged by this one individual. "I want to believe that," she said softly. But trust is difficult when there is so much uncertainty. Ethan nodded, a flicker of something like regret passing over his features. I know, and I don't expect you to trust me immediately. But I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and help you complete your mission. You have my word. He finished bandaging her wounds and sat back on his heels, giving her space. Xyla flexed her limbs experimentally, marveling at the reduction in pain. Human medicine was clearly more advanced than she had anticipated. Thank you, she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Gratitude was not an emotion she had expected to feel towards a human. Ethan stood, offering her a hand once more. We should get moving. The crash will have attracted attention, and not all of it friendly. We need to get you to a secure location. Xyloth frowned. Secure location? My base camp, Ethan clarified. It's a few kilometers from here, in a defensible position. We can regroup there and figure out our next move. Xyloth's instincts screamed at her not to follow this human into unknown territory. But what other options did she have? Her shuttle was destroyed, her pilot dead. She was alone on a strange world. Ethan, for all the danger he potentially represented, was also her best chance at survival. Steeling herself, she reached out and took his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. Lead the way, Ambassador Stark. Ethan flashed her a quick, approving grin. Just Ethan, please. I've never been one for titles. And with that, they set off into the forest. The human and the alien, two representatives of vastly different worlds, now bound together by circumstance and the tenuous beginnings of trust. The journey ahead would be perilous. Xyloth knew that much for certain. But for the first time since she'd stepped onto the shuttle, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Maybe, just maybe, humanity was more than the sum of their violent past. Maybe this Ethan Stark could be the key to understanding them. Only time would tell. For now, all Xyloth could do was place her faith in the strength of an unexpected ally and keep moving forward, one step at a time. Trials in the wilderness. The forest closed around them as they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the canopy blocking out the sun and casting everything in a green, shadowy hue. Xyloth struggled to keep pace with Ethan's long strides, her injuries and unfamiliarity with the terrain slowing her down. Ethan, for his part, seemed perfectly at home in this environment. He moved with a fluid grace, ducking under low-hanging branches and navigating over gnarled roots with ease. It was clear he had spent a great deal of time in the wild. As they walked, Ethan kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out various plants and animals, explaining their properties and habits. Xyloth listened with rapt attention, marveling at the depth of his knowledge. You seem to know this area well, she observed during a lull in the conversation. Ethan shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. I've spent a lot of time in places like this. It's where I feel most at home, honestly. Out here, things are simpler, purer in a way. Xyloth tilted her head, curious. But you're a diplomat, aren't you? Surely your duties keep you in the cities among your people. Ethan's smile turned a touch rueful. True, but whenever I can, I escape to the wilderness. It helps me clear my head, put things in perspective, reminds me what I'm fighting to protect. Xyloth pondered this as they continued on. The more she learned about Ethan, the more he defied her expectations. He was a contradiction, a man equally at home in the halls of power and the depths of the wild. It was intriguing and a little unnerving. They had been hiking for several hours when Ethan suddenly held up a hand, signaling for Xyloth to stop. She froze, her senses immediately on high alert. What is it? She whispered, scanning the forest for any sign of danger. Ethan's face was grim, his body tense. We're being followed. Xyloth's heart rate spiked. By whom? Not sure. But they're good. Staying just out of sight. Ethan's hand drifted to the holster at his hip, resting on the grip of his sidearm. We need to keep moving. Try to lose them. They set off again at a quicker pace, Xyloth pushing through her pain and exhaustion. The knowledge that they were being stalked sent a chill down her spine. Who could be tracking them out here, so far from civilization? They kept moving for another hour, taking a winding, circuitous route in an attempt to shake their pursuers. But every time Xyloth thought they might have lost them, Ethan would tense, his head cocked as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Finally, as they were crossing a shallow stream, it happened. A shot rang out, the sound cracking through the forest like thunder. Ethan reacted instantly, tackling Xyloth to the ground and shielding her with his body. More shots followed, zipping past them and ricocheting off the rocks. Ethan rolled to the side, drawing his own weapon and returning fire. Xyloth huddled behind a boulder, her heart pounding in her ears. The firefight was brief but intense. Ethan moved with a soldier's precision, his shots deliberate and controlled. After what felt like an eternity, but could only have been a minute or two, the shooting stopped. Ethan crouched beside Xyloth, his breathing heavy. "Are you all right?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her mind was reeling. She had just been shot at, on an alien planet, by unknown assailants. It was surreal. Ethan peered over the boulder, scanning the tree line. "I think we're clear for now. But we need to keep moving. Whoever that was, they'll be back with reinforcements." Xyloth swallowed hard, forcing herself to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but she willed them to hold her up. Who were they? Why would they attack us? Ethan's jaw tightened. Could be a lot of reasons. Some people don't take kindly to the idea of aliens on Earth. Others might see you as an opportunity, a source of advanced technology or knowledge they can exploit. Xyloth shivered, the weight of her situation crashing down on her anew. She was a target, a prize to be captured or eliminated. The reality of it was staggering. But as she looked at Ethan, saw the determination in his eyes, the set of his shoulders, she felt a flicker of something else, something warm and unfamiliar. It took her a moment to place it. It was safety. Despite everything, despite the danger and the uncertainty, she felt safe with Ethan. He had protected her, put himself in harm's way for her. It was a level of commitment she had never expected from a human. Ethan held out his hand, his gaze steady. "We'll get through this. Together. I promise." And as Xyloth took his hand, felt the strength and surety of his grip, she believed him. Against all odds, against all her preconceptions, she trusted this human. They set off again, the forest seeming darker, more menacing than before. But Xyloth walked with her head high, her resolve hardened. She had survived the crash. She had survived the attack. She would survive this too. And maybe, just maybe, she would come to understand the complex, contradictory species that was humanity. A choice and a sacrifice. They ran. Through the dense underbrush, over rocky outcroppings, across babbling streams. The sound of pursuit never seemed far behind, the crack of gunfire an ever-present threat. Xyloth's lungs burned, her muscles screamed with every step. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Not with Ethan right beside her, his hand clasped tightly around hers, urging her onward. They had been fleeing for what felt like hours, the adrenaline and fear driving them beyond the limits of exhaustion. But Xyloth knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, their pursuers would catch up, or they would collapse. Neither outcome boded well. Just as she thought she couldn't take another step, Ethan pulled her to a stop. They had reached a small clearing, a break in the relentless trees. Ethan leaned against a boulder, his chest heaving. "We can't. Keep running," he panted, his face slick with sweat. "Need to find a defensible position." Xyloth nodded, too winded to speak. Her eyes scanned the clearing, searching for anything that could give them an advantage. A thick copse of trees, a rocky overhang. Her thoughts scattered as a new sound reached her ears, the thrum of an engine, growing louder by the second. Ethan heard it too. His head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Shit, they have vehicles." He pushed off the boulder, his expression grim. "We need to split up." Xyloth blinked, certain she had misheard. What? They're tracking me. I'm the one they want. Ethan's gaze was fierce, determined. If I lead them away, you'll have a chance to escape. Xyloth shook her head vehemently. No, no way. I'm not leaving you. Xyloth, we're in this together, remember? She gripped his arm, her nails digging into his skin. I won't abandon you. Ethan's face softened, a myriad of emotions playing across his features. For a moment, Xyloth thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his hand coming up to cover hers. All right, together then. They took off again, angling away from the sound of the approaching vehicles. But it was clear their options were running out. The engines grew louder, the shouts of their pursuers more distinct. They were being hemmed in, driven towards a destination not of their choosing. And then, abruptly, the trees gave way. They stumbled to a halt at the edge of a sheer cliff, a dizzying drop yawning before them. Far below, a river churned, white-capped and furious. Ethan cursed under his breath. No choice. We have to climb down. But even as he spoke, the first of their pursuers broke through the tree line. Men clad in black tactical gear, their weapons trained on the exhausted pair. Ethan pushed Xyloth behind him, his own gun drawn. But it was a futile gesture. They were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The leader of the group stepped forward, his face obscured by a helmet. Drop the weapon. Stark. It's over. Ethan's jaw clenched, his finger tightening on the trigger. For a tense moment, Xyloth thought he might actually open fire. But then, slowly, he lowered the gun. You don't know what you're doing, he said, his voice low and steady. This is bigger than you can imagine. Than any of us can imagine. The leader scoffed. Save it. We have our orders. The alien comes with us. He gestured with his weapon, motioning for Xyloth to step forward. She hesitated, fear and indecision rooting her in place. And in that moment of hesitation, Ethan acted. He spun, his arm encircling Xyloth's waist. And then, before she could even process what was happening, he leaped. Off the cliff. Into the open air. Xyloth's scream was torn away by the rushing wind as they plummeted towards the churning water below. She clung to Ethan, her eyes squeezed shut, certain that these were her final moments. But just before they hit the water, she heard Ethan's voice in her ear, barely audible over the roar of the wind. Trust me. And then they were swallowed by the raging river, the icy water closing over their heads. The current seized them, tumbling them end over end, battering them against rocks. Xyloth fought to keep hold of Ethan, but the river was too strong. With a wrench that felt like it tore something inside her, they were ripped apart. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was Ethan's face, his green eyes wide and desperate, his hand reaching for her. And then there was nothing but the cold and the black.